Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our class. This week is going to be a little different because, of course, our readings were videos and not actual text. And so I'm trying to record a lecture based on 2 hours of documentary filmmaking, which is going to be a little different. Hopefully, it's not disjointed. Let's get into it. Go ahead and share my screen. Okay, here we go. So, welcome back to Trek 101, Philosophy of Star Trek, Lecture 8. Khan! That's a terrible joke. But his whole spaceship moving towards Earth thing made me think of Star Trek, and certainly the synthesizer music didn't help there. We are, of course, talking about ethics in science, and this is Lecture 8. We're talking about Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Before this, I'm going to hope that you watched his 2 episodes that I have posted there in YouTube links. Those are episode 1 and episode 3. As I understand it, the whole series is available on Hulu. It's also available on YouTube in several different places. The 2 links I found were the best that I could get, but there are a lot of ads there. Sorry about that. Trying to make it more accessible. If you can find it on Hulu, go ahead, but I know not everybody has that streaming service. I certainly don't. And so this is the one I've posted. What else? Oh, this is going to be our only lecture this week. Realistically, I tried to stretch this into 2 and it just felt a little bloated. And also, as I look at our schedule, next week is pretty heavy in terms of reading. And so let's just keep it light this time around so that we can not make you do too much work 2 weeks in a row. So what are we doing today? We're going to look at some points that Carl Sagan makes, take a look at his positioning on the following. First, his definition of science, whether he gives one or not, is one of the questions I want to ask. His history of science, specifically what he draws attention to and what he obscures. And that's not a criticism right here at the top. I'm not trying to take the man down. Realistically, whenever any of us gives a history of something, just by nature, there are things that we emphasize, things that we don't. And part of having a more communal perspective on something is that we can mention what somebody else might obscure because of their background, because of the way they understand things. So that's not a hit on Carl Sagan. That's just the reality of things. What does he obscure? We all obscure things. Then also his understanding of humanity, because he talks a lot about, what are humans? What is our place in the universe? What is our purpose? His interactions with ethics in these 2 episodes are also some interesting points here that I want to spend a little time on. And then finally, I have some thoughts and questions, and I don't have answers to these questions, but they are things that stuck out to me while watching this. So let's get into it. So first, Sagan's definitions of science. And he does not provide a single overarching definition on the nature and quality of science, and he doesn't have to. This series is a PBS documentary based on a book that he wrote. So in a sense, it's really just a higher budget but significantly older version of what I'm doing right now. It's just me and a laptop here, but Carl Sagan had the whole of, American public broadcasting behind him. Those pledges went to good use because it is extremely well done. But knowing that this is for a public audience, he's assuming that we all have a working understanding of science in our head. So here are the things he emphasizes in what science is. Science, to Sagan, is the human power of self-determination, that it is the way that we as a species get to decide where we want to go, how we want to be in the world, and what we want our future to be. It is also the way in which we direct our wonder towards the cosmos. He has a real emphasis on wonder, and it is something that I appreciate. That he's not looking to master nature here. He's fascinated by it. He wants to appreciate it. Science is also the accumulation of knowledge. This comes up particularly in his discussion of the Library of Alexandria. Science is also free inquiry. And this is where he sort of opposes science and religion when talking about the Middle Ages and when talking about Kepler. We'll get into that in a little bit. And science for Sagan is also the discovery of natural laws. What is it that underlies reality and ties us all together. It's that we all live under the same fundamental laws of nature. That when I drop a pencil, it falls to the earth, and when you drop a pencil, it falls to the earth. Moving on. He also does his little history of science, some in episode 1, some in episode 2. And in episode 1, he does something very important, which he begins his history of science outside of human history. In fact, significantly before human history. He begins with the Big Bang and the creation of the universe. Humans are in that history, but they're not the sum of that history. And what I would point out here is that there's a fair amount of current scholarship that uses this idea, especially in geology. A class that I took last semester was looking at the philosophy around the idea of the Anthropocene, which is a question in geology, asking, okay, so humans have left a obvious mark on the planet, and what does that mean for us? But that assumes that history is longer than human history. It starts with the history of Earth and the geological record there. And so that's an important distinction. The other histories of science we looked at, they started with Aristotle or the pre-Socratics. And here, that science begins before we had a concept of time and before our species existed. And then in with that, Earth is presently unique, but Sagan does assume other life in the universe. And that really deals with his value of humanity, right? That we might not be alone. That's on another slide, though. We'll talk about that. Within human history, he has a nice little emphasis on the Library of Alexandria as this citadel of human consciousness, where in the ancient world, this was where science happened. He talks about, how someone who worked at the Library of Alexandria first understood that the Earth was round and calculated the exact curvature and size of the Earth. The Library of Alexandria was dedicated to the study of cosmic order, so there's one of his definitions of science right there. After the library burns down, he talks about the Middle Ages as a time where human scientific inquiry was sleeping. And I'm going to put quotes there because I'm going to say he wrongly assumes that this period was motionless in terms of scientific inquiry. In reality, there was a lot of scientific inquiry going on here, both in and out of Europe. Observatories for astronomy were built on churches during this period because the stars needed to be studied because people wanted to understand the universe better so that they could better understand their creator. That's why Kepler's doing the work that he does later. And then this also kind of ignores stuff we talked about in a previous lecture, like the House of Wisdom and other histories of science, that scientific inquiry was still being done. It just wasn't being done in Europe in the way that Sagan defines scientific inquiry. So even though he begins the history very broad, he does get pretty narrow here. And I think it's worth bringing up. And then he also names science as the only form of progressive knowledge, the only one that's worthwhile. And this is where many people outside of the West would say, hold on, there was a lot of progressive knowledge going on during this little period of history, especially outside of the West. It's just that they weren't focused on analyzing and mastering nature. Scientific inquiry wasn't what was happening, but they were inquiring into the mastery of self in other places, like Taoists kind of emerged. And is that scientific inquiry? Well, no, but is it valid as they're trying to understand the human condition and how to better master ourselves? Yeah, that's valid. That's a good form of inquiry that, while not science, is still worthwhile. And a notable lack of mentioning, mismention maybe, is that he does not bring up the beliefs and works of the man who came up with the Big Bang Theory, which was a French scientist and priest. Very fascinating and influential guy. I've got his name there. I'm no good at French, but I can link his book if you're curious. I found an ebook of it, and it's hard to read, but clearly a brilliant guy. Came up with the theory that Sagan himself believes, that is, the foundation of the building blocks of the universe. And it's weird that it's not mentioned. Doesn't mean that Carl Sagan is wrong, doesn't invalidate Cosmos, but I found it strange, so I put it here. Then what else happens? Well, episode 3 is all about Johannes Kepler. And the history here is that Kepler rejects astrology, which is a pseudoscience, in favor of astronomy, which is a hard science. We should mention that Carl Sagan is himself an astronomer, and so his affinity for Kepler is understandable. And Kepler is, as we see in the episode, a very sympathetic character. He seems like he just wants to do science. He wants to understand things better. You know, he's a sweet guy. He wants to take care of his mom. He's likable. And Kepler makes huge strides, mostly building on the Copernican model. Now, we might mention here that the Copernican model actually came from the House of Wisdom first. That's in one of our previous lectures. And that Kepler works with Tycho Brahe, but doesn't like him very much, probably because Kepler is far more religious than Tycho is, and he doesn't like how loose Tycho is with his life, and it actually ends up being what kills Tycho Brahe, is he dies of his lifestyle of overconsumption. Even so, Kepler needed his resources because Tycho Brahe was rich, and he had the instrumentation that Kepler would need to get these observations of the cosmos, so that he could do the math on it to discover what was really going on. After this, Kepler discovers elliptical orbits, so the planets orbit in ellipses or ovals. And Johannes Kepler was not well loved by religious authorities. And here's where we might want to talk about, well, what does Sagan obscure? And not that he does this on purpose. I'm not calling him a liar. It's just, where does his perspective maybe fall short? So why exactly was Kepler persecuted by our religious authorities? And this is all kind of lumped together, and that might be a problem, because the Catholic Church didn't like Kepler, not because of his scientific inquiry. Maybe that factored in a little bit later, but mostly because he was a Lutheran, and he's living in a place ruled by the Catholics, and they're getting rid of him. They're not calling him a heretic because of his scientific work. They're calling him a heretic because he's a follower of Martin Luther. And then what's going on with the Lutherans and him? Well, that is actually even less clear. He is excommunicated in that he's not allowed to take communion. But the question remains, from how high up in organization did that come? At this point in history, there's actually multiple kinds of Lutheranism, and which ones are saying that he can't take communion? And it's not like they're jailing him and forcing him to recant, right? It's just there's a limit to his participation because of disagreements with his theology. And for Kepler, astronomy was theology. Sagan doesn't quite understand Kepler's religious convictions. At one point, he said something like Kepler's work ethic was something special. And realistically, if you look at Johannes Kepler's writings, his work ethic comes from the fact that his belief was that his work was worship. So why does he engage in science to such a heavy degree with so much energy and so much emotion? Because he believes that he's serving his divine creator in doing that work. And I don't know if Sagan quite gets that. He'll say the words at some points, but the heart of it seems to be something that he misses, and that's okay. He also says that Kepler valued truth over dearest delusions. But what exactly were those delusions? Because again, Kepler doesn't exactly reject his own faith through the process of scientific inquiry. And Cosmos kind of leads us down that road, but that's not historically what happened. So I'm wondering what those delusions were. Were they just a geocentric universe? Because if so, then yes, Kepler did reject that. Was it that the planets orbited in spheres? Because again, yeah, he rejected that for the elliptical model. But to say that he embraced science rather than faith might be a step too far. It might even be a step too far to say that those were at all opposed in the mind of Johannes Kepler, because they did not appear to be. They also were not opposed in the mind of Copernicus We've talked about Galileo and how they probably weren't opposed for him. And really, after him with Isaac Newton, Newton was also deeply religious. So, should we be opposing faith and science like Carl Sagan does? I would say no, but also in kindness to Sagan, that was where the discourse was at the time that these were recorded, and he is, of course, now dead. Current scholarship is different, but current scholarship has the benefit of building on the work that he did. So that's there. I thought I would bring it up. What about his understanding of humanity? And there's some really good stuff here. Sagan says at the beginning, look, we're made of star stuff. You know, the material that makes up the universe has been there since the beginning. It's currently expressed in you and me and in the desk and in the microphone. And, yeah, sure. That's a fine understanding of humanity. And in a way, that lessens the distinction between human and non-human. It gets rid of sort of the mind-body dualism that occupies a lot of philosophy. It's interesting stuff. And it also gives him sort of this fundamental respect for humanity and for material reality, that we should be respecting both one and the same. Even so, he's careful to position humanity in the universe, that humanity is obscure and from a backwater planet, that our solar system is not at the center of the universe, and therefore humans are not the most important thing. He says it multiple times, we're probably not alone in the universe. Earth is a present and temporary home. There's nothing inherently special about the Earth or about humans, and we'll likely encounter other species. Another thing here is he talks about humans as a danger to themselves. And this is another place where current scholarship might pause and ask, is that too broad of a definition? Do we need to clarify there? Because certainly there are a lot of dangers to humanity that have their origin in things that humans have done or are doing. But do all of us inherently share in that blame? We might say that something like climate change, for example, well, it's something like 100 companies that make up 70% of carbon emissions. So realistically, who is responsible here? Who is the danger? Am I as dangerous to humanity as the CEO of Nestle? Probably not, right? Does that mean that Sagan is wrong? No, but I wanted to point out that present scholarship is asking this question in kind of a different way. That when we're asking about who is to blame for the danger to humanity, there are scholars that would say there are some people that are more guilty of this than others. And then he also talks about how we have an inherent choice between enhancing ourselves through science and meaningless self-destruction. And I don't know, we'll come back to this. I'm interested in this projection that he gives us for the future. And then also, he sort of relies on this Cartesian assumption that humans are primarily thinking things, that what drives us and is sort of the central essence of humanity is that we're thinking things. And, he gets this from Descartes. I don't know how consciously he gets it. Certainly it's in Aristotle as well. And we've talked about this in previous lectures, right? I'm not personally a huge fan of the idea that reason is the thing that makes us primarily human, but there's no real engagement with that here, but it is worth pointing out. What about how does Sagan interact with ethics here? In a couple ways, actually. And again, there's some good stuff here. For virtue ethics, some virtues that I pulled out of this would be wonder, which again is opposed to this desire for mastery. Sagan is just amazed by the cosmos, by the universe. And certainly that sense of wonder is enhanced for us, the viewer, with all this synthesizer music and digital images of planets. He also values truth, no matter where it leads, no matter what assumptions it tears down. And maybe there's this opposition of faith and science here, but the value of truth is still a good thing. He values free inquiry, unfettered from whatever human systems it might be that push free inquiry down. He values life. It's rare, it's special, it's always good. If we encountered it on other planets, it would still be rare, special, and good. And there's this value of order, that the universe is fundamentally ordered, there are natural laws that govern it, and so on. In terms of deontology, two higher goods that we can name that are certainly aspired to are that science exists for the sake of science. So, what's the highest good? Scientific inquiry, and it will always be good in the mind of Carl Sagan. Something to aspire to. And then also this vision of human progress, that through scientific inquiry, even though it is a good of its own, our species as a whole will progress, right? In terms of consequentialist ethics, the consequences are human progress versus self-destruction. He lays it out pretty cut and dry there. There's no ifs, ands, or buts for him. Where he doesn't mention is consequences for the other than human. And I find this to be interesting, right? Because he begins his conversation of history outside of the scope of human history, but we don't get any discussion of the consequences for non-humans. And maybe the assumption is, well, through correct scientific inquiry, we'll work all that out and it'll be okay. But I don't see much value judgments on consequences for environments, animals, for the planet, or potentially for other planets. In this discussion of Mars, one question that has come up that I'm curious about that Sagan doesn't touch is how much of Mars needs to be set aside as, natural land. We have forest preserves and, national forests and wilderness areas here in America. Are there parts of Mars that need to be set aside for that as well? Does Olympus Mons need to be kept as a camping area? Maybe. This leads me to what I want to call some points to ponder. First one, in terms of philosophy, what good is the knowledge of an ordered universe? Because I don't know that people who emphasize order tend to answer this question. There's a quote here from Abraham Heschel, who we've talked about before. He's a Jewish theologian, philosopher, historian, biblical scholar. He's one of those all-arounders who was far smarter and far more successful academically than any of us ever will be. But he has this question, which is order the most that divine wisdom could produce? We are more anxious to know whether there is a God of justice than to learn whether there is a God of order. Is there a God who collects the tears, who honors hope and rewards the ordeals of the guiltless? And that's in his book, Man is Not Alone. And it's a good question to ask, right? We read Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, and one of the things he's most famous for saying is that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And those who want to emphasize an ordered universe and those who want to emphasize a just universe are fundamentally asking different questions. And it doesn't mean that the universe can't be both ordered and just, but typically those who are arguing for an ordered universe come from more of a place of privilege, especially in the world of theology. Order theology tends to legitimize the power of the powerful, whereas theology focused on justice tends to seek justice for those who have been treated unjustly. And does that mean that there is no justice in Sagan's universe? Probably not. But if we had him here, if I could summon him and speak to him, I would ask him about, is there an inherent justice to the universe, or do we have to make justice for ourselves? And that really is justice a more fundamental question than order? Because what good is order if you are at the bottom of society? I don't know if this vision of reality gives us an answer to that question. Yeah, it is what it is. And then Sagan emphasizes wonder over mastery. And here we want to separate him from Bacon and Descartes, who we talked about in our last lecture. They began in a place of saying we need to master nature for the sake of humans. Sagan, on the other hand, he believes that we should begin in wonder. He doesn't want to force nature into human categories. It's more that humans need to discover things in nature. And from doing that, we will progress. And I wanted to point out that separation there because it's a different starting point. And I wonder if it leads him in a different direction fundamentally. Certainly, Bacon and Descartes did not care about leaving the bounds of the Earth. Sagan does. He's interested in space travel. He's an astronomer. Moving on. What about this assumption of humans as primarily thinking things? I get hung up on this. You don't have to get hung up on this. But is scientific progress only important because we value scientific progress? What if we valued instead moral progress or progress as communities, as societies? What role does science play there if something else is sort of the central value? And with that, are scientific progress and destruction the only two choices? Why is it a binary? Again, I'm sure he would give a very nuanced answer if he was here, but he's not here. He's dead. And so we're here to answer these questions ourselves. One moment. Sorry, a little bit of a cold lately. But, we could say that that is a false dichotomy, that we don't need to think that we'll destroy ourselves if we don't study science, that it could be that our continued scientific inquiry is what is destroying us, right? Science brought us the oil industry. It's polluting the planet. Does that mean science isn't good? Well, no. Just we might want to ask more questions. And then finally, Sagan has a kind of faith that science is inherently good. But I want to know, well, what is it in his estimation that makes science good? And that leads us into the questions we're going to be asking for our discussion this week, because it's okay to believe that science is inherently good and that scientific inquiry will always lead humanity to good places. But you need to justify that. And at least in these two episodes, he doesn't. So what's next? We have two things to read for next week. We have chapter 4 in our textbook and this piece from the National Academy's Fostering Integrity in Research. There's 3 chapters there. You need to read the summary, chapter 1 and chapter 2. There's a PDF link in Canvas for that. It is a full book, but they've put it out for free. I have 2 lectures for next week. I am going to do 2, doing 1 this week just because, again, we didn't have as much material as I thought we did. There's also a quiz for this exact module that is due at the end of next week. Please take it. You guys did a pretty good job on the quizzes for module 2, so keep up the good work. And as always, I want you to post in our discussion forum for the week. I want you to do that for this week. So what is our question? So to wrap up module 3 here, here's our prompt. And I want you to answer this question with a paragraph dedicated to each question. You might notice that there's 3 sub-questions in our big question here. So we've examined several definitions of science here. How would you define science, you personally? And what is science for? When I ask what is science for, I mean, what's the purpose of science? What's the goal it's reaching towards? And what is it that makes science good? And it's okay to say that science is not inherently good. It's okay to disagree there. But if you are arguing for science is good, what is it that makes it good? I'm curious to hear your answer. I think there are some very good and very valid answers that you can get there. And certainly the reading we've done so far offers plenty of answers you could draw from. Because we had videos instead of text this week, there's no need for an in-text citation, because that leads us to weird places of trying to cite exact minutes in the video, and we might be watching different versions of the video, so I'll waive that point. Congratulations on the free point. With that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to go watch the Super Bowl, and I will see you next week. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and yeah, you all have a wonderful day.